We're going to talk about unconscious bias, but my first words are going to be about institutional racism, because 20 years ago this year, when the report into the Stephen Lawrence inquiry was published that talked about institutional racism in the police, it was a very big step forwards for anti-racist and justice campaigners. However, today, people will be aware that there's been a massive rolling back of people trying to say, particularly people in the leading roles in the police force, trying to deny the existence of institutional racism. And quite often, because they can't deny the existence of racism, they just want to deny the existence of institutional racism. This then blurs into, let's talk not about institutional racism, but let's talk instead about unconscious bias. But you also see unconscious bias coming up not just with the police, but I don't know if people saw, this was actually a brilliant series that The Guardian did in many ways, where they dug into the statistics and the experiences of black and other minority ethnic people in Britain and produced this whole study into the level of racism that people face and how they experience it. But they didn't call it racism. Again, they called it unconscious bias. And actually, unconscious bias has become quite an important theme as well in questions of the workplace. This is from the review that was led by Baroness McGregor-Smith in 2017 that has become very influential in employment law and in the government, that highlighted structural historical bias, said it was worse than the racism that was more overt in the 70s, and one of its key recommendations was that unconscious bias training should be expanded and that the government should play a role in doing that. So unconscious bias is kind of growing and is out there. Not only that, it's a huge field of training. In fact, it's very big business. In America, it's estimated that companies spend over £8 billion a year on unconscious bias training. A lot of that goes towards unconscious bias training for the police, but a lot of it, I think it's about $4.5 million in New York alone has been given to train members of the NYPD, but also it goes in private firms. All your big companies will be running unconscious bias training for their employees. And these are just some of the courses that I found when I was looking online. I'll tell you, one of the things that I found is that if you're looking up unconscious bias training packages, companies, trainers, they all seem to favour a light blue presentation. I actually think there's a reason. I think they've decided that that is the least threatening colour. And we're going to talk about this because one of the themes about unconscious bias is to make it non-threatening, is to deal with racism in a way that is non-threatening and reassuring. And apparently, pale blue is a very reassuring colour. This one, you'll notice, is purple, but that's because that one is actually run by activists and not by a corporate company. So, you know, maybe this, anyway, I'm not going to go too much into the theory of colour, but I don't think it's an accident that everybody seems to use this colour scheme. Anyway, to move on to the topic. So what is unconscious bias? So this is, the Equality and Human Rights Commission did a very useful study actually looking at some of the evidence about whether unconscious bias training actually works, and we'll talk a bit more about that. But this is the definition that they gave of unconscious bias. So unconscious or implicit biases, unlike conscious biases, are the views and opinions that we are unaware of. They are automatically activated and frequently operate outside conscious awareness and affect our everyday behaviour and decision making. So basically, the idea is that these are ideas that we all carry around, that we're not even aware of, that influence our behaviour and our decision making. And one of the big themes of unconscious bias is that this is a natural process and a natural part of how human beings process the world around us, that we make quick decisions that aren't always thought through, we make quick assessments of people and situations when we see them, and a lot of that draws on these unconscious ideas that we carry around with us. And theories of unconscious bias are related to any characteristic, but they're most often used around questions of inequality and oppression, particularly around gender and racism. And this meeting is specifically focusing on racism, but there are lots of examples people might want to talk about unconscious bias and the question of gender. Now, before I go any further, because I'm going to say a few things, I think, hopefully to challenge some of the ideas that unconscious bias training and theories of unconscious bias rest upon. But before I do that, I want to really make this point, which is that I'm not saying at any point when I become a little bit more critical that unconscious bias is not a real thing, because unconscious bias is a real thing. unconscious biases can be held by any of us, including anti-racists and people on the left, will carry around various, preconceptions, unconscious bias, half-formed ideas, assumptions that we make about people in our everyday interactions. They might vary from people to people, but I'm not saying that they're not real things, or that they don't impact on other people in the way that we relate to other people. For those of us who work in services, I work in the NHS, and I actually think it's very important to think about unconscious biases in the NHS because of the service that we deliver to our patients, who come from many different backgrounds, many different parts of the world. I work in London, and actually unconscious bias can affect our interactions with our patients, and you do need to think about why people behave in particular ways, where they might be coming from, that you aren't just imposing your own views on them. So actually, I am in favour of people challenging unconscious bias, of raising awareness of it and people talking about it, and I do think it's a useful thing to do, but it has to be done in a way, I think, that is constructive and that is useful. And I also don't think it's the end of the story when it comes to talking about how we challenge racism, both in the workplace and in wider society. And I'm going to say some of the reasons why that is. So the first thing is, I think we need to think about what are some of the underlying assumptions behind people who promote the ideas of unconscious bias. So I talked about how it's become very fashionable among police chiefs, for example. This is Sarah Thornton. This is her comments on the 20th anniversary of Macpherson again, about why unconscious bias is really a term that they should be using in the police rather than institutional racism. She explains unconscious bias by saying, we prefer people who are like ourselves because we understand them and they are familiar. People who aren't like ourselves, sometimes we feel less comfortable with. What are those stereotypes that we sometimes just fall into? And I think this illustrates what I was saying about some of the main ideas around unconscious bias are that they're just a natural response to people that we don't know, that it's something natural about how we respond to people that we don't recognise, who aren't like us, that it's somehow just a part of natural human psychology. But actually, it's a very simplistic view of human psychology, and it's a very reductive view of human psychology, because first of all, it's based on an idea of we don't necessarily understand people who are not like us, or we feel suspicious or hostile towards people who are not like us, which begs a couple of questions. The first question of which is, how do we decide who is like us? Who is like us? The way that Sarah Thornton talks about it is that it should be obvious who is like us and who is not like us. But actually, you think about who is like us. There are different competing versions of Britishness. There are different people that you probably identify with that, other British people, your Boris Johnsons in the world, would not identify with. This is a picture from the Sudanese Revolution. We very much identify. We feel they are like us. When we hear their stories at the rally yesterday, we feel these are people like us who are fighting for justice. There are migrants. Some of us feel they are like us and that they are people. Other people in society say they're not like us and they should be treated differently to us. So these are very political questions, and they're not formed in the abstract. So the question of who we feel is like us and who is not like us is not a natural phenomenon. It is a political question that is shaped by the world in which we live and is shaped by big political forces. And actually, this subtext of what Sarah Thornton was saying, when she talked about who is like us, is she meant what coloured skin do people have, is what she really meant. Are people like us? She's a white woman. Are people like us white, or are people not like us black? Or if you're a black person, or you know how this thing works, that like us, not like us. And why is the question of what ethnicity people are, or what their appearance is in terms of racial categories, such an important question in determining what is like us and what isn't like us? And that's because we live in a society that is dominated by racism and racist ideas. Race is not a natural category, it's something that's been created and is fostered, and we'll come back to some of these themes later. But just before I say that, just before we come on to this question, there's another question around the psychology, which is, actually, when we say we prefer people who are not like us, who are like us, and we feel hostile towards people who are not like us, actually, there's also nothing natural about feeling hostile towards people who are not like us, because there are actually lots of potential reactions to people who are not like us. You could feel curiosity, you could feel interest, you could feel compassion, you could feel solidarity, you could feel indifference, you could feel Attraction, you could feel all sorts of different things. So why is it assumed that the only emotion that is natural to human psychology is hostility to people who are outside us? So these are not natural things. These are things that we need to question, and we need to ask where some of these assumptions are coming from. And this really does come on to this question that we've already touched upon about where do unconscious biases come from. That even where people act on unconscious biases and make assumptions about people based on their appearance or based on very small information that they might know about them, they don't come from nowhere. They come from a society that propagates stereotypes, images, ideas about how the world is organised. And in particular, when it comes to racism, they come from a racist society. So I think rather than naturalise this as a function of human psychology, we have to say that even where unconscious bias and other forms of racism exist, they're not a product of a natural function of human psychology. They're a product of a political system that is pumping this stuff out all the time. And like I say, we'll come back onto this in a minute. But of course, lots of people who talk about unconscious bias and who train in it do also understand this as well. They do see those biases that people carry around with them as a reflection of wider society. One writer calls it a thumbprint of society. But the problem is, if the focus still remains on just challenging individual psychology, and training exists only at the level of individual psychology, then you're actually missing this whole bigger picture on what are we going to do about the racist structures in society that have created all these unconscious biases and all these problems and all these stereotypes in the first place. So I want to talk about some of these issues. I think the other problem with the focus on individual psychology is that it can be very pessimistic, because if the idea is that we all have unconscious biases, essentially what they're saying is that we all carry racist ideas, or at least all white people are unconsciously racist, then really what you're saying is that all we can do is try to make people aware of their inherent prejudices, which is not the same as challenging either the prejudices or challenging the society that creates them. And this kind of ties into an argument that was hinted at in the report I talked about earlier, the report into the workplace, that racism has never really got any better. That racism has always existed because it exists in the psychology of white people. But what happened was in the 70s it was overt, and when it became less acceptable to be racist, people just repressed it. And the argument is now people are just unleashing their inner racist again. Now, in one sense, there is some logic to this, because what happens when populist politicians spout racist ideas is it becomes more acceptable in society to express racist ideas. So I think for some people that probably is true, that people who would be a bit quieter about their racism feel emboldened to project their racism, be more active and more open about their racism. But it's not true that levels of racism in society never go up or down. And one of the things that happened in the 70s is that there was a mass movement against racism, which took many different forms, but one of the largest forms obviously was the work that the Anti-Nazi League did. And you can see the brilliant exhibition that's over in the People's Palace corridor of one of the carnivals, but you can see the huge mass movement that for a while drove the worst areas of racism back, and didn't just drive back the most overt racists. I think it actually changed the culture of anti-racism and racism in Britain, and I think that was a real transformation. So it's important, I think, that we say that racism can be driven back and that it can reassert itself, as we're seeing currently at the moment. And that's one of the things with unconscious bias. Because it's about a natural phenomenon that always exists inherent in human beings, it disregards and denies the specific histories, both of racism and of anti-racism. So it ignores the question of what role does racism play in the world? Where did it come from in the world? How have people challenged it before? Because you don't need to know any of these things to deal with unconscious bias. You just need to know that it exists at the level of human psychology, and we need to try and deal with the human psychology behind it. So it denies the specific histories, both of anti-racism and of racism itself. And it also encourages a reliance on experts, because if racism is unconscious, then it's not something that we know that we have. Then it needs experts, trainers, specialists in order to uncover it and to reveal the racist ideas and assumptions and biases that people might have. And there is a whole industry that has formed around the question of how to reveal people's unconscious or implicit biases, the biggest part of which has been the growth of implicit association tests. I don't know, has anybody here ever done an implicit association test? There's a couple of people. There's a couple of people who've done one. When I was preparing for this meeting, I did one. And really, what it is you sit at a computer screen, and you have two hands. So it only works if you've got two functioning hands. Anyway, that's a different question. But you have to work on the. Basically, it's about how you associate concepts such as good or bad with images that relate to black or white people, or you can do it over gender, or I did one over sexuality. So you can do it over a particular characteristic, and it's about how quickly you associate a particular term. You can go to this website and try one for yourself. In fact, over 5 million people have already tried their own implicit association test. So it'll give you a better idea of what I'm talking about. There are lots of problems about it. The science behind it is very poor, despite its huge popularity and its widespread use. The science is actually supported by quite poor evidence, and in the biggest investigations into the evidence around unconscious bias, it's also showing not just that it's poor evidence for uncovering unconscious bias, but that even where it shows level of bias, there is no evidence that that affects behaviour, or the behaviour of a person and the way that they behave towards people in any way at all. And this is one of the problems with the whole unconscious bias thing, is you can make people aware of their biases, but there's actually no evidence that just making people aware changes their behaviour in any way. There's no actual scientific evidence for that. And so there's a whole series of critiques, I haven't got time to go into all of them, that are based around the science of implicit association tests and how much can you really tell from the speed at which somebody clicks with one hand on a computer about what that really tells you about their psychology and their attitudes. The second thing is there is a whole social and political critique of this, which is really, what is it testing? Because these images are absolutely abstracted from real life situations. They're just images. They're not actually interactions. They're not actually the way in which you would encounter people. So say you're a health worker, looking at an image of a black face isn't the same as actually meeting somebody who's in need, who has particular issues, who's arrived in a particular way, who's in particular distress for a particular reason. They're totally abstracted from real life. And that's some of the problems with them, that they're totally abstracted. In fact, there's a whole list of different problems with them. That the ideal result in implicit association tests is that you would have neutrality. Essentially, it's promoting a version of colour blindness, that you would actually have no difference in your response to somebody, whatever their characteristics. Now, I think that that's not really our aim in society, because we have to recognise that there is oppression of particular groups of people. We're not just after neutrality, we're actually after saying some people suffer more in our society than other people, and their stories are more important, that our compassion is more important towards those people. So it's based on a very neoliberal idea, actually, of individual neutrality and colourblindness. And the other thing really is, you'll see from the number of people who visited it, that it's actually become a kind of form of recreational self-help. You know, and I'm not against self-help. I'm not against people thinking about what makes them a better person, or, you know, how to change themselves. I'm just not sure that this is an effective strategy for challenging structural inequalities in society. And I'm not against people enjoying things like doing these little tests and these little quizzes that we do in magazines and all those things. I just don't think they really tell us very much about what's going on in society, and I do think they fit with the whole way in which neoliberalism encourages us to see problems in society as individual lifestyle amendments that need to be made. And I think it kind of goes down that line. Having said all those critiques, when I did my implicit association test, I was very relieved that I came out without any nasty unconscious biases, even though I actually had no belief in the way that this works at all. So you do it, and then you'll probably feel relieved as well if you manage to. And if you don't feel relieved and you get it wrong, don't tell anybody. So I won't tell anyone either. So it is worth doing, just because it will give you a bit of an idea of what's going on with it. And so the idea of unconscious bias and the implicit association tests, I think, is part of a whole sphere of work in this area, which is about seeing the question of unconscious bias and racism as not a political problem that needs a struggle to destroy it, but as about a psychological problem that needs a technical fix. And so one of those technical fixes might be the tests that I've talked about, but the other technological fixes could involve the growth in functional MRI scans that purport to be able to recognise emotional behaviour and look at which parts of the brain are activated when you're thinking racist thoughts or when you're having particular emotional responses, or people have even moved into the sphere of medical solutions to unconscious bias. So there was a study in 2012 from Oxford University that claimed to prove that if you took a beta blocker, then that could stop implicit or unconscious bias. Because it would, well, I don't know, anyway. And there was also a study in 2015, a Dutch study, that claimed to show that forms of induced brain stimulation could also reduce prejudice. And one member of the Dutch team even had the tenacity to suggest that the work that their team was doing meant that, this is a quote, the dream of Martin Luther King may become a little closer. Because he's discovered this way that he can zap parts of your brain. Anyway, I'm sure people can see lots of problems with the way that this stuff is going. And I want to introduce one particular problem, which I call the salmon of doubt, which is not to be confused with a novel by Douglas Adam of the same title. The salmon of doubt is actually a salmon that a neuroscientist, Craig Bennett, bought from a fish market and took it to his lab and put it in the functional MRI scanner. It was a dead fish, by the way. And it was already dead when he bought it. He didn't harm it in any way. It was dead. He bought it from a fishmonger's. He put it in his MRI scanner in his lab. And then he showed it. This is a quote so that you know what he's actually doing. A series of photographs depicting human individuals in social situations with a specified emotional valence. So this is what they do with functional MRIs. They put people in functional MRIs and they show them particular images to provoke emotional responses so that they can measure which parts of the brains are activated. So they put the dead salmon in the machine and showed it similar pictures of humans in different emotional situations and monitored its brain. And what he said was that it actually looked as though the fish, the dead fish, was thinking about the pictures that it was looking at because they could see similar patterns on the functional MRI scan to when a human being did it. So this is why it's called I would say it's called the salmon of negation or the salmon of disproof, really, but it's called the salmon of doubt. Now, this is not to say that there is no scientific value for functional MRIs, but it is to say that we're not really at a position where we can conclusively talk about the value of functional MRI scanning, certainly in something as complicated as the question of racism or human emotions or the human brain, which you may realise is a hugely complex organ that people still don't really understand, even the neuroscientists. So when people are trying to baffle you with science, you can just remind them of the salmon of doubt. And the other thing, I think, with both implicit association tests and with the whole concept of unconscious bias, is actually it just assumes that these biases are unconscious. But actually, I would say there's a kind of sliding scale between unconscious racist ideas, conscious racist ideas, and propagating racist ideas. And sometimes you don't know which they are. And if you're a victim of racism, do you even care which they are? I'm not sure you do. Because the experience of racism is still the same, whatever the motivation of the person carrying it out. And I was thinking about this because I don't know if people saw the story last week about the black man who was in the hospital in America with pneumonia, who was on an IV drip, who went outside the hospital because his doctors had said you should go for a walk to get some fresh air, get some exercise, and was outside the hospital with his IV drip on and got arrested for suspected theft of the IV device. Now, this, to me, you could call this unconscious bias, and it probably is. You know, people have seen a black man and they think he's a criminal. You see many stories like this, you know, and there is proof that police are more likely to shoot people who are black. They're more likely to think that black people are carrying guns, that black people who go to McDonald's are more likely to have the police called on them. I don't know if people remember that story as well. The question is, we don't actually know what the motivation of the people involved in that was. We don't know whether it was unconscious bias, they just saw a black man and thought he was a thief, or whether they were racists and they saw a black man and thought he was a thief. And so actually, I think we have to unpick some of this stuff a little bit more, because there can be, like I say, there can be a variety about it. And I think the biggest problem with the framework of just addressing racism through unconscious bias is that it lets people who are in power off the hook. And this is one of the reasons why police chiefs and company bosses are so keen on unconscious bias. Because if racism is the product of individual psychology and biases, then nobody at the top of society is to blame for these. So the police chiefs aren't to blame for the continued racism in the operation of the police force. The people at the top of companies aren't to blame for their biased hiring and employment procedures, for the fact that so many black people face disciplinaries and dismissals in the public sector, for example, where we know this is overwhelmingly the case. Because they're not to blame, it's all the individuals in their company and all the biases that they carry around. And in actual fact, one of the things that using unconscious bias as your main framework does is for people who are in positions of power, it can make them try and portray themselves as they are the enlightened people who are trying to stamp out all the nasty biases among all their employees, and that they're the people who are going to bring enlightenment to their companies, to their practices, to the police force, and drive back the worst elements of kind of some of those base instincts of some of their employees. So this, for me, is the biggest problem with unconscious bias. It lets the rich and the powerful off the hook, and not just employers. What about all those people who pump out racism day in and day out? Your Boris Johnsons, actually your Jeremy Hunts, because let's not let him off the hook either, but your Theresa May, who set up the hostile environment in Britain, who created the Windrush scandal, and who actually continue to propagate the hostile environment. All of these people who whip up racism, and we could talk about Trump, we could talk about people all around the world. If racism is reduced to the question of unconscious bias, it lets them off the hook, because they are the people who are pushing the worst elements of racism. And we should also remember that racism isn't something that, if you're a victim of racism, that you just experience at the level of ideas. It isn't that people have an unconscious bias and you come across that. These make structural impacts on people's lives, and in terms of inequality, injustice, and even in terms of, if people are being shot by the police, even in terms of life or death scenarios. So racism is much bigger than the question of unconscious bias. And I want to just look, really, before we open up for discussion, at a few questions around strategy. Because there are a number of strategies proposed for dealing with unconscious bias. We've talked about some of them, the technical fixes, the medical fixes. There are also things like anonymous recruiting and anonymous marking. And actually, some of these are proven to expose the levels of racism that happen in recruitment, for example. There was a famous experiment where they were auditioning for an orchestra, and they put a curtain across in front of the people who were performing to try and audition for that orchestra. And actually, not being able to see the person who was performing raised the number of black people who were recruited to that orchestra hugely. So these things do make a difference. The other things that are suggested, which is why I'm not writing all this stuff off. I'm not saying none of this stuff is valuable. I'm just saying we need to put it in some kind of perspective. There are also, they suggest things like exposure to counter stereotypes, that you need more role models. It's all very vague, some of this stuff. Or that you can apparently on that website for the IATs, you can also download positive screensavers. So every time you switch on your computer, you can see a positive image of a black person. I'm not sure what it is, because I haven't actually looked at it myself. Anyway, I thought the pictures of Black Lives Matter was quite a good positive image of black people, so maybe you could download that. But technological solutions is a really big industry now in trying to make computer games that alter human behaviour, and one of these big ones is, around this question, and virtual reality medical solutions. So these are some of the strategies that I talked about. Wrong button. And now I just want to say a few things about the problems, and then I will finish. Some of the problems with unconscious bias and the strategies associated with it, firstly, are that they are an idealistic strategy, in that, not idealistic as in utopian, idealistic in that they are based on ideas, not material reality. So the focus on individuals, as we said earlier, doesn't challenge where those individuals get their ideas from. It just tries to tamper with that individual. It doesn't deal with the problem. It doesn't deal with the root of where racism comes from. As I said earlier, there is no evidence that any of this training, however much it raises awareness, and awareness is a good thing, but there isn't yet any proper evidence that any of this changes actual behaviour, even though it may make people more aware. And awareness is a good thing, but actually we want to change both behaviour and structural inequalities. And that comes to the final point, really, is changing people's ideas doesn't change the experience of people who are experiencing racism, and it doesn't challenge the structural inequalities that people face, because I don't believe, for example, in the police, that the problem is just about the unconscious bias of individual police officers, although I do believe that that is a problem. I also think it's in the whole way that the police force is led, is structured, the function that it plays in society. And so those ideas come from the top of that institution, but they also come from the role that that institution plays in the world. And that's why institutional racism is a much better way to understand those things than unconscious bias. Second criticism really is, are these strategies about mitigating bias or about eradicating racism? And I think, actually, when you look at the strategies around unconscious bias, they're about mitigation. They're aiming, as I said earlier, to be colourblind, and they are quite limited, because even though I talked about actually anonymous recruitment and anonymous marking, which has been in the universities for a really long time and came out of demands quite rightly from the students to say we want anonymous marking, actually, when you look at the impact, for example, of anonymous marking, its impact has been very limited, because actually the inequalities in the education system don't start and finish at the question of marking. They start in schools, with the black kids being expelled in schools or being treated differently in schools. They carry on through colleges, they go on to university, they exist in who gets to go to university. They exist in every level of education. So although I'm in favour of anonymous marking, let's not pretend this is going to deal with racism in education and unequal outcomes for black students in our education system, because it's such a small part of what is actually a bigger systemic problem about how racism works. And the other thing with unconscious bias, which I've already kind of talked about a little bit, is that it depoliticises racism. And this is a quote from somebody on the American Board of Police and Public Safety Psychology about actually why people like this, because they like things that are based on psychological evidence and not on politics. In other words, they like to not really be challenged, I think is really what this is saying. And this fits really with my kind of final point before I conclude, which is really one of my real concerns with the way that unconscious bias works, is it seems to be a form of non-threatening anti-racism. And actually, everybody who puts together packages of unconscious bias training recommend that you start with things that are less threatening to a person, such as their preference for youth over elderly. Or the ACAS guide has got a suggestion that you should start with an example of, well, this is the example they give, of a manager who prefers employees who have no qualifications because he didn't do very well at school, and so he likes other people who didn't do well at school. Now, I think that's a really bizarre way to think a manager is going to behave in the workplace, but the idea is that you start with things that are non-threatening. This is just, I like this cartoon. There are loads of really good cartoons about how to be a non-threatening woman in the workplace. There are loads of them. If you look that up, just Google it. There are loads of them, and they are very amusing. But I think, to get back to a more serious point, I think this is something that Doreen Lawrence has flagged up, is the way that anti-racism is going in mainstream discourse, where we've moved on from, at the time of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, from talking about racism, institutional racism, but also wider racism in society, to talking about diversity, which diversity is a much less threatening term and is a much more neutral term, because we can all embrace diversity. We don't have to deal with the question of racism. But actually, today, we have to defend diversity, don't we? Because things have got worse yet again, and even diversity doesn't really seem to be on the agenda of most politicians. Now it's you have to be a certain form of British, with British values. It's become much narrower than even the question of diversity. And when it comes to the question of tension and non-threatening racism, I think we have to say that actually racism has never been beaten or driven back, or any structure of racism demolished, without an actual struggle and without some tension with the people who are in power. And Martin Luther King wrote about this when he was in prison in Birmingham jail. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than justice, who prefers negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. And I think if we take anything from this, as I said earlier, I'm not saying that unconscious bias doesn't exist, but I am saying that if we want to beat racism, we can't allow a strategy that just focuses on individual psychologies and just looks on the level of the individual. Because racism is a huge structural inequality, and you can look at any area of racism. You can look at education, employment, criminal justice, any area of racism, and you will see these are huge structural injustices. These can't be undone one by one by tampering with individual psychologies. These can only be undone by struggle, by tension, by fighting the powers that propagate these things, by driving back racism through collective action, through solidarity, through building mass movements. And it's only ever mass movements. From the beginning of the history of racism, it is mass movements that have driven racism back. And every time that racism has reared its ugly head, from the beginning of slavery, which was resisted by slave revolts and by people in other countries fighting in solidarity with slaves, to today where people fight back against the Nigel Farages and the Tommy Robinsons, and we're out on the street in mass numbers to do that, racism is only beaten by mass movements and by people willing to stand up for what they believe in. So we need to build a mass movement, and we need to think about where racism comes from, and we need to think about the fact that it's structured into a capitalist society for the interests of the rich and the powerful, and that's why we have to challenge the rich and the powerful if we're going to get justice and eradicate racism.
So, who would like to make a question or contribution? Yeah? I'll get the mic to you.
Thanks very much for that, Esme. That was brilliant. I'm glad you scored so well doing that test. I'm not quite so confident that I would. And I say that because, being as old as I am, when I was brought up an anti-racist without really having met any black people at all, and also opposed to anti-Semitism without having met any Jewish people. I didn't know what Jewish people were, other than that, you had to be opposed to anti-Semitism. And really, what was absolutely crucial for me was the movements, the Black Power movements in the 1960s, when the whole surge of Black is beautiful and the assertion of civil rights actually changes. It's the power of those collective movements which actually changes people's attitudes in terms of what is considered to be probably unconscious biases. And the same is actually true, I think, of LGBTs. That without the lesbian and gay struggle, which actually with people asserting their sexuality and their right to their sexuality, and the trans movement, actually you can have the right sort of attitudes, if you like, in terms of opposing all sorts of oppression. But again, it is that collective struggle which actually both situates where you are in terms of who your solidarity is with, but also changes your headset. You don't change your headset individually, like Esme was saying. It is as a consequence of collective struggle and debates and so on and so forth in the context of that struggle, which really brings about change in people's individual minds because of the relationship between the change of the individual to the changing dynamic of the collective.
Okay, thank you. Can we guide us down here, please? And remember, if you've got any questions as well, we'll just as welcome on anything that Esme or anyone else has discussed.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to something that Esme said at the beginning of her introduction. Said one of the problems with understanding racism at the level of individual psychology is that it creates a picture in which, an incredibly pessimistic picture in which change doesn't really become possible except through the change in individuals. One of the reasons why I doubt this explanation for racism is that it can't explain why levels of racism change. When I grew up in the 1970s, life for Asian people was surrounded by a range of stereotypes that talked about us being passive, of having no language skills, being rubbish at football, a whole series of stereotypes which nowadays are not held by the majority of people. You have to explain how the psychology of millions of people has changed over the course of 40 years. Now, to me, that's not because 40 million people individually assessed their own prejudice. Rather, there were enormous struggles. And the struggles were, in part, the anti-racist struggles that Esme pointed to, but there were also the struggles of Asian people themselves. If you think about what happened between the mid-1970s and the 1990s, we started off with enormous workplace struggles at the Imperial Typewriters factory in 74, the Grunwick strike of 76, and a whole series of other Asian strikes, which put on the map for the working class movement in Britain that Asians will organise and that Asians will fight, and when they will fight with the most militant of tactics. It proved to the world that a lot of the stereotypes that were surrounding us weren't valid. When you think about what Asian youth did, fighting against the National Front, against the BNP, being prepared to stand up to police racism, even to the extent of rioting, meant that no longer, by the 2000s, could you say that Asian youth were supplicant and prepared just to be told what to do. And in part, all of that has led to a change in the way we're perceived. Not all of those perception changes have been positive. Some of them are more contradictory. However, the idea of individual racism lurking in the psychology of individuals cannot explain the nature and changes of people's ideas. Even if the nature of racist ideas themselves are changed, it can't explain that either. You have to look to wider social phenomena to explain why people's ideas change.
Thank you. I'll take the person here so we're not zigzagging.
Thank you so much. That was a really, really great talk. My name is Leah Cream, and I'm from Toronto, Canada. I just want to talk a little bit of what's happening in Canada because I think your talk related well to it. I mean, right now, I think our country is really grappling with racism and discrimination against our Indigenous peoples. So this talk totally reminded me about how right now there's something of a public debate on genocide of Indigenous women and girls, and it's a historical fact that this has happened, and it actually is still happening, but the broad Canadian public and media, a lot of mainstream media are saying like this is debatable and asking people like public polls, right? Is it, has there been a genocide of Indigenous women and girls? But there absolutely has, much structural violence against them. But the broad and mostly like white population is grappling with ongoing colonization of Indigenous peoples. And I think, through a discussion about residential schools, what Indigenous peoples went through after being dispossessed from the land, people coming to terms with the like material roots of racism against Indigenous peoples. So I'm trying my best to, stand in solidarity with them and do research on this. And actually in the labor movement, I found that Indigenous workers were very much, in the early Canadian capitalist period, they were workers, industrial workers, and, we haven't really uncovered their histories and seen them as people in the labor movement and part of union struggles and all that. But I'm wondering, basically on that note, if you can talk a bit about like why workers and say like trade unionists will go against their class interests, and be racist, say against Indigenous peoples or black and brown other workers, right? Because we do have unions that clearly are engaging or I guess identify with the far right. Are actually they have many xenophobic or anti-immigrant sentiments. Often, sometimes to like protect their own jobs and their own interests in that sense. But if you could talk a bit about that, like why do people engage in racism in that sense? That'd be really helpful.
It's a really good question. I'll take the guy second row from the back.
Hello, thanks Esme, that was really great. I guess my question is, are they mutually exclusive? In the sense does one engender the other? I would obviously go for institutional racism engenders unconscious bias. Just wondering what you think is unconscious bias a useful tool in just not assessing how we solve racism, but assessing the impact of institutional racism? Because I assume when you do studies, I mean, now for example, I think The Guardian published a study by, I think Oxford did it, where they showed that Middle Easterns have to make 190% more applications than a white person to get the same job. Pakistanis 170, and I think Nigerians 180. And I was just wondering if it's useful, although not to say that, okay, unconscious bias, because like you said, you're 100% right. It individualizes it and it makes it about just people, so you can't change the system. And I think, like you said, that's the reason why they do it. But because you did mention that it can be useful. I was just wondering your thoughts to kind of elaborate on that, whether it is a useful tool in assessing just the impact and the pervasiveness, I guess, of institutionalized racism and how it really gets into people's minds. Because, I mean, I feel like, as many people of colour here would feel, that you sometimes do feel that white people have this automatic reaction, and it can be, you have to switch that off and you have to realise, but it does feel sometimes that it's, and I like I said, I think that one engenders the other. So I think institutional racism causes that, but I was wondering if you think unconscious bias is a way of understanding it more.
Thanks. If you could just pass it down to, and I'll take that next, and then can we go after to the guy over here in the blue shirt?
Sorry, dropped the mic. I work for Show Racism the Red Card, which is an educational anti-racism charity, and I have two thoughts. One about unconscious bias explaining racism wouldn't explain why we're seeing a massive spike in racist incidents in schools. How come they went away if we've all got this unconscious bias? But my second thought is about what Doreen Lawrence was saying about diversity, and I think just to look at it from a practical point of view, and obviously we wouldn't sort of say the key to challenging racism is through government intervention, but just in terms of in Wales, we're working with the Welsh Government because there's a new curriculum coming out and everything. A lot of talk about celebrating the diversity of Wales, whatever that is, and in some places I don't think they think there is any diversity in Wales. But when we are addressing the question that local authorities are backing off from what they thought was a legal duty, it turns out it wasn't, but they thought it was, so they did it, reporting and recording racist bullying in schools, is now being backed off from, and the government guidance is now saying, you should do it, it's best practice, but they're not having to do it. And it's to do with this notion of diversity, the Equality Act, with the 9 protected characteristics. Racism is not being addressed as a question anymore, even though 80% of hate crime in England and Wales is race-related, but you're still being told, we can't do that, we can't make schools report racism because we then have to make them report other identity-based bullying, like that would be a bad thing. But it's just this notion that diversity has become this kind of catch-all. We don't have to talk about racism because it's not very nice, makes people uncomfortable, and therefore we can talk about diversity. And I think that the actual implications of that are that racism is going unchallenged, and it's only by challenging it as a mass movement that we're going to actually push that back.
Thank you. If you could just send that over here, Wayland.
Okay, I want to agree and say what a good meeting is. And one of the studies was done about how, when unconscious bias comes up, about where people stand. Take 2 pictures that they tested. One was Aaron Kurdi, whatever it is, what was people's immediate response? People's immediate response was shock, horror, and we want to do something, and it led to welcome refugees. The other one was what happened with Ortez with the child, drowned inside. That's the immediate response. But then there's an absolute work done to try and undermine that. Every newspaper comes out, attacks that idea. So the idea that it doesn't come from, it comes from nowhere, is actually structural. What we find all the time, I work with Stand Up to Racism, I'm being constantly told, don't mention racism, it's political. That's literally that you're being political when you bring it up like that. In schools, this is political, we want to talk about racism in a non-political way. And the reason why this is important is I have to unfortunately deal with the police on many demonstrations, and people say, what changed the police? What changed the police, to be honest, what changed the police wasn't they changed themselves. I asked them actually, why is it that when I used to go to demonstrations in the 1970s, we used to turn up and you immediately beat us up. You didn't ask any questions, you immediately start laying. He goes, what stopped you from doing that? They turned around to me and said, we found there was mass conflagration in the urban cities when that happened. In other words, riots. Black and white people came together, and their unconscious bias meant they assumed that black and white people wouldn't join together and fight them because they had common interest in terms of doing that. And that's what changed people. It wasn't because they decided to change, they overcame their unconscious bias because we fought them. And so when we talk about what's the agency of change, what we must, when we're talking about this, it's very important we discuss all these things because all the time we're trying to change and challenge it. It's discussed and the discourse takes place. But what we're looking at is agency of change as well. How do we change it fundamentally? We can explain it, we want to digest it, statistically understand it, but fundamentally we want to change it for the future generations. It's not just a small question. I think when you see the growth of the far right, and you see what's happening, they are building off of this. So we cannot just be completely internalised to it, although that's important. We have to talk about a method of being able to do it. And that's the reason why I think you have to connect it to socialism, you have to connect it to the question of fundamental change in our society.
Excellent. Could we go to the person back row in the blue, and then I'll take the guy in the yellow here. People are keeping very well to time.
Oh, sorry. Hi, great meeting. Obviously it's about racism, but I just want to pick up a little bit about sexism as well, just in the general sphere of unconscious bias, and how important I think it is that you don't let people off the hook with things like their use of language, because that all comes into the unconscious bias. And it's this thing of like, you know, you should be grateful you've come this far. You can't be picking people up on every single thing. It's not their fault. You know, people have been talking like this forever. You know, you just don't make too much of a fuss. I'm thinking specifically of something someone posted on my my union Facebook page, not the official one, pointing out the fact that, I'm going to get this wrong because I don't know anything about football, but Phil Neville was coaching England's women's football team, and that he said, and we were down to 10 men, and someone had rightly said, oh my God, what is going on? Like, everyone's been getting really excited about it, and he's still saying things like that, sexism is everywhere. And she was absolutely right, and I totally agree. But the amount of people on there, and most of them were men, but some women, most of the men were still saying, oh, come on, you should, you know, this has been a great thing. Women, I'm a teacher, so everyone, you know, girls and boys in my school have been super excited about the Women's World Cup. This is a great step forward for feminism and etc., etc. Don't, like, beat the man down because he said we're down to one man. And, you know, that 10 men. And the point is this, that it doesn't take away from the fact that he was a great coach, I don't know if he was or not, and they've done brilliant things, great, well done. But that doesn't mean you still shouldn't kick up a fuss about the use of language. He said, we're down to 10 men, and why shouldn't you challenge it? But the amount of men on this forum telling us, the women who were complaining about it, to basically shh, calm down, you know, calm down about it, just be grateful for the crumbs, it is ridiculous and insulting. And, you know, we do need to kick up a fuss. That picture on there is exactly right. You know, never mind the polite, you know, coughing when someone says something you don't like. Women or black people or anyone else who's oppressed by this use of language, which is part of this, you know, unconscious bias, as people could argue, those are exactly the times, of course, say something. Of course, if you're going to recognise the unconscious bias, we have that's the point, isn't it? It's not enough to just recognise it, we have to do something about it. We point it out every time it happens, otherwise it just perpetuates, and there's obviously, we're never going to get rid of it. So that's what I'm going to say. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to the person who asked the question about why do people do things that aren't in their interests? If it's in the interest of the working class to unite, why is it that sometimes you get racism even in trade unions? And I think that this is one of the questions which has bothered socialists as long as there have been socialists, really. Why do people do things that seem to be going against their interests? And I think one of the reasons is this idea that it's very much in one group of interests for people not to unite. And if you go back as far as the... if you look through history to the struggle against the slave trade, for instance, there were lots of people in Britain who joined together with slaves to fight against the trade. Ever since that time, rulers have been trying to keep quiet about that and act as if it was just down to them, being particularly kind that things changed. And all the way through, you keep seeing this stuff again and again. But I think less important than the rulers themselves is the fact that lots of people, often trade unionists, sometimes ordinary workers, start accepting the things that the rulers say. We've got something in common. All white people say they've got something in common, and people accept that argument when it's not true. And it actually takes time to break through from these sorts of things. But it's something that Marx talked about. He talked about how, ever since you had the beginning of racism, the beginning of capitalism, you've had attempts to get people to hate each other. And he started by talking about how there was prejudice put about against Irish workers in Britain. And he wrote in a letter, the antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit and the comic papers. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class despite its organisation. That's why these things keep coming up, because people accept ideas and because you have to keep challenging them. But the positive thing, and I think this is why we need the history, is precisely because people do keep challenging them, and anti-racism does keep coming back.
Thanks a lot. I'm just going to take, in the back row, please, Roger.
Oh, so I want to raise. Hi, thanks. Just like to come back on the comrade who asked the question about unconscious bias. As a disabled person, and this is an important question, as a disabled person, I can guarantee that there's an awful lot of unconscious bias towards me or other disabled people by everyone, pretty much, or a lot of people in this room here today. That doesn't mean that I think you're all out to get me. There may be a lot of muddled ideas and wrong-headed thinking, but that doesn't mean that you're the seat of the problems in the world that I experience. And in terms of how then, with the reality of that unconscious bias experiencing, we need to actually attack it is we do it from a different direction. And we have to understand, and we do as socialists, that the racism, disableism, sexism, homophobia are social constructs. We look at what goes behind and underneath what's going on in the world, not just what's on the surface, at individual reactions, but where these things have actually come from. And we understand that from the class context of a ruling class that has to divide people in different ways, and it does so for different reasons and in terms of racism, different reasons in terms of disableism. But it's got its own interest in part in doing that, and it's that separation, that pushing away, that othering of people, that then allows these muddled ideas and the wrong thinking to develop in people, either through lack of contact, as Sheila was talking about, during your early years, or because of stuff that's pumped out to us in the press every day. So our role as socialists is absolutely clear. We have to start from that perspective. Once we win those arguments, again, in the workplace or on the wider context of industrial and world struggle, then we can begin to address the idea of unconscious bias in the individual sense, and then help people to understand what's going on in their minds and to change them in the context of how we change the world.
Thanks a lot for everyone, your contributions and questions. I'm now going to bring Esme back to sum up.
Well, is this on? Yeah? Cool. Thank you everybody for a really interesting discussion, and it's only Friday, so I'm hoping these discussions are going to keep running throughout the whole weekend, because this is a really big issue that we are grappling with, about the enormity of the challenges that we face around racism. But at this weekend we actually have time to drive down, I think, into some of the elements of racism and how we deal with it. So thank you for everybody's contributions, very useful and very informative. I'm going to try and reply to some of the questions and return to a couple of themes that I've raised already. Before I do that, I just want to mention this particular book. Do you like my graphic there, the little arrow? I'm learning the PowerPoint, you see. It's going to get better every year.
Why is it that colour?
What did you say?
Why is it that colour?
Oh yeah, good point. Oh, yeah. Because it's less threatening. I don't need to feel threatened. Anyway, this is the book where I read about the salmon of doubt in question, and it has loads of it's from an American background. The guy is a legal scholar in America, but it is a really, if you're interested in this area, I would say this is a really thought-provoking book, and it has loads of evidence in it. I don't think it's in stock at Bookmarks, but you can order it from there. But there are some other books at the front touching on these and similar themes. There's obviously Say It Loud, which a group of us wrote together. There's Mistaken Identity, and there's a new book that's out that I haven't read yet, but I've heard is very good, about the return of so-called scientific racism and some of the debates around that. So I recommend people go and get some of the books for further reading. But to come back to some of the questions that people have talked about, somebody raised a very important question about, are these things mutually exclusive? The question of structural bias and of unconscious bias in individuals. And you see, I don't think they are mutually exclusive as part of how racism functions. But what I do think is that institutional racism is a better way of understanding them. So unconscious bias is a real thing. People have real unconscious biases, and the studies that you're talking about do show the level of those unconscious biases. And so when you ask, is it useful to have studies that expose the level of bias that people experience, or the level of racism that people experience, which is how I would describe it, then yes, it absolutely is. And when The Guardian did their series that was called Unconscious Bias, what they actually revealed was the level of everyday racism that black and other minority ethnic people experienced. And I don't care whether they call that unbiased or unconscious bias or racism in one way, but I personally call it racism because it's a much more encompassing field, but it is useful to explain the reality and to go through the statistics of people's experiences with the police, people's experiences in employment, the experiences in education. I think are shocking, and it's really interesting to hear about people who are working in schools, because this is what I was saying, is it doesn't start just at the university level where you see some of the starkest inequalities. It actually starts with the work that people are doing in schools. So it's actually very interesting to hear all of these different things. So I do think studies that you may call unconscious bias are very useful, and they do show how some of these issues impact on people, and it's very important to expose those things and to keep reminding people about those things. I think about the NHS where I work, actually black people are less likely to be promoted, are more likely to be disciplined, and are more likely to be sacked if they're disciplined. And these are important figures to get out there. Now I think that's to do with general racism in society. It's to do with institutional racism in the welfare state. And it is also to do with the unconscious bias of people who are processing those disciplinaries, who are processing those different aspects of employment. So it's to do with all of those things, but we have to put them back in some kind of order where we can work out how we can deal with the problem. So they're all part of the problem, but let's try and get to the root of how we deal with the problem. And you see, the reason I say unconscious bias isn't as good as institutional racism is actually institutional racism, as defined in the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, creates space for understanding unconscious bias. It talks about unwitting prejudice as part of how institutional racism functions. So it's one part of how institutional racism functions. And therefore, I think we should remember that's one of the reasons that institutional racism, I think, is a better fit and a better way of describing it. I think it's also worth remembering that institutional racism didn't start with Macpherson. There's a much more radical history of people talking about institutional racism that actually came out of the Black Power movement, and we haven't got time to talk about it here, but it's something that people might want to think about, the more radical roots of the question of institutional racism and why it is that certain institutions in the world that we live reflect the kind of racism that is pumped out by the top of society. Which brings me to my next point, really, which is that there's lots of racism that isn't unconscious and that is pumped out by the very top of society. And so I think when we come back to this question of racism, we have to keep coming back all the time to saying racism doesn't start in the heads of ignorant individuals. It starts with the top of society, where people constantly pump this stuff out. And actually, in one sense, you have to say, if racism was so natural, why do they have to keep propagandising over it so much? Why does the press, the politicians, the media have to work so hard to convince us of their racist myths and their racist lies? I was looking at these newspaper things. I've seen this one. Migrants take all Nobels in Britain. I was like, is that a bad thing? Is that, anyway, whatever. Anyway, there you go. The Daily Express obviously thinks that's a bad thing. I put all these people up here because it's really frightening that it looks like we are going to have Boris Johnson as our Prime Minister, a man who talks about picking their knees, who talks about Muslim women in the worst possible terms. We already have Trump in power, we have Salvini. But I've also put Jeremy Hunt up there because people think he's not such a nasty character, but I don't know if anybody heard him on the Channel 4 News, basically justifying Britain's role in sending refugees back to the Libya camps where they were basically bombed this week and killed. And Britain has had a key role in doing that, and let's not let Jeremy Hunt off the hook for the role that he plays in the Foreign Office and the role that he plays in defending some of the racist actions of the British government. But to come back to the question that was raised about why do workers accept ideas that are not in their interests, I think it's a very important question because, you see, I think it's pretty obvious why people at the top of the society accept racist ideas and propagate racist ideas, because it helps them. It helps them to create scapegoats, to take the blame away from the problems that they've created in society, the misery that people face, the inequality, the poverty, the environmental destruction, all the problems that are created by the top of society. It's really helpful for them to create scapegoats to try and divert that anger away from them. It's also very helpful for them to create a divide and rule where they can try and divide people by turning people against each other. And you see this in different parts of the world in lots of different ways. But whipping up hatred of migrants is part of them trying to say, where I work in the NHS, there is a whole industry around trying to say the problems that we face in the NHS, the lack of beds, the lack of staff, the waiting lists, isn't to do with the cutbacks, the privatisation, the ward closures, the lack of enough staff in the NHS. It's to do with migrants coming over and taking all, and it's the same in housing, it's the same in education, scapegoating and dividing and rule. So you can see why the rich, the powerful and the leaders in the world accept these ideas, but it's a much more important question of why do some working class people accept these ideas? Because it's not in their interest, it's not in the interest of any working class person to fall for this sort of rubbish. Because actually, it makes us weaker. It makes it harder. If we're divided and ruled, it makes it harder for any of us, black, white, Asian, or from any ethnicity, to fight actually for the services, the jobs, against climate change, for any of the things that we care about. It makes it much harder when we're divided. And so why do some people fall for that? And I think people fall for that partly because it is so everywhere. It is so absolutely permeates society everywhere. It is so blanket coverage of this sort of racism at the moment that some of that seeps into people's ideas. But also I think it's because people are alienated. Because working class people don't have, or don't feel that they have, control over the world in which they live, over the work that we do, over the way... Think about climate change. How... You know, people feel powerless in the face of such a big catastrophe that's happening. It can make people feel powerless. People feel powerless in their workplaces quite often. People feel powerless in their lives. And that means that they are more likely to accept some of these rotten and racist ideas. And that's why when we talk about the importance of struggle, it isn't just about changing ideas, but it's also when you create a feeling of people having power, it's much easier to overcome some of these ideas. It's much easier for people to see who the real enemy is when they're fighting back to change things. It's much easier to break down some of these ideas. So that's some of the questions about why people accept it. And I'm just going to wind up really with a couple of quotes that I think hopefully will illustrate the relationship between ideas and struggle that I'm really trying to get across. Because I'm not saying it's all or nothing, and I'm not saying that there's no role for awareness or for training. And as I say, where I work, I would much rather we had unconscious bias training than we had nothing. But I would much rather we had anti-racist training and anti-racist work than that we had unconscious bias training. So there's a scale of these things, and I think we have to work where we are on the different things that we can do. But one of the important things is to remember that the most effective way of changing hearts and minds is to build big mass movements that reach into all areas of society that can pose an alternative to people. And so I'm going to finish by quoting. I know a lot of meetings at Marxism quote Marx or Lenin, or I've quoted Martin Luther King. I'm going to actually quote somebody's not often quoted at Marxism, which is Christopher Eccleston. So here's a quote from Christopher Eccleston, which I think illustrates really well how ideas can be changed by mass struggles. He was 13 years old when the Anti-Nazi League formed. He says, I'm white and was raised and conditioned in an era of racism. The ANL was a beacon of hope, defiance and beauty. My young eyes saw black, brown and white people standing together in unity. It is perhaps hard to imagine now how inspirational that story that was. It changed lives and minds. We need it again. And I think you see the impact that some of those mass struggles have had in the 1970s. We know the impact that they had on black and Asian people who were feeling victimised by the National Front, who felt immensely empowered and enabled by the mass struggles. But you also see the impact that it had on white working class people who saw an alternative to some of the racism that surrounded them and that they've been brought up with. And so mass struggle can also be about changing individual consciousness. And my final quote that I'm going to leave you on is from the great American abolitionist and freed slave Frederick Douglass, because when we're talking about there is no progress without struggle, and we're talking about the enormity of the world and the challenges that we face of driving back Trump, of Bolsonaro, Salvini, we can name all our demons, and there are many, many more. We have to remember that we also have power, and that change has come, and that every generation that has faced racism has fought back really brilliantly against racism. And I won't read the whole quote, but I will mention that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And so we have to be part of our generation's struggle against racism, and many of us already are. We have to build the mass movements that stand up to racism, of love music, hate racism, of taking up the questions of racism through whatever ways that we can, of building that mass organisation. But we also have to say that every generation has fought against racism, but we'd really like to live in a world where every generation doesn't have to have another fight over all of these issues. You think about the fights we're having now, and many of them do feel like we're back in the 70s, of racists feeling emboldened to go on our streets with the most disgusting propaganda, where migrants are being witch-hunted and drowned in the sea by Western governments. And actually, we want to live in a world where that's not the case. So we have to build the mass movements against racism, but we have to connect them to a struggle that will get rid of this society that is built on racism and war and inequality and climate destruction. Time is running out, and the task is urgent, and we have to fight for a society that's based on socialism. So if people agree with that, please join us. The Socialist Workers' Party needs you, and you need us. We need each other, and we need to build a mass movement that can change things.